Fellow, dim the lantern and let your breath slow. You hear the hull's slow groan first, wood contracting against endless water, ropes humming like distant insects. Then the nearer sounds arrive. A slap of wet canvas, a man's low curse on the wind, the repetitive clink of iron where men have been fastened. You wake to that chorus, pressed against wood and bodies, smelling salt and sweat, as if the ocean itself had been ground into the timbers. For a moment, the world is only that, dark, hot, small. Then memory sharpens. A market, a shouted bargain, the flash of a blade, and the ship becomes more than wood. It is the hinge between two worlds. This narrative is not the transcript of a single-name manuscript rescued from the earth. It is a careful reconstruction, a voice assembled from the depositions, ship logs, sail records, abolitionist narratives such as Equiano's, court testimony, and the fragmentary accounts preserved in Portuguese and Brazilian archives. Where specific details are missing, I will say so. Where the archives speak clearly, I will tell them plainly. The Portuguese trade sent hundreds of thousands across the Atlantic. In the long century of the traffic, from the 16th into the 19th, the ships that carried human cargo took lives at sea and remade lives ashore. Many of those transported to Brazil came from the West Central African coast, especially the regions around Luanda and the Congo. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, Mozambique and the East African ports also fed the trade. Whatever the port of departure, the voyage followed a brutal logic of close space, scarce air, and time measured in months. You are in the hold. There is a small aperture, a hatch, and through that a day slice enters, a white streak that tastes of sunlight and tar. Around you are bodies, men bound shoulder to shoulder, women pressed in narrow lines, children curled into laps. The crew lowered you below, not because they wanted to hide you, but because ships were built to move profitably. Hides, sugar, and people were packed to the limits the timbers could bear. The smell is layered: human exhalation, mold, sea spray, and those animal odors the crew tolerated only because they were paid to. Rats run along the beams above like shadow-stitched seams. Chains and irons are a practical cruelty. Historians debate the degree of tight packing and the calculations captains made. Ship manifests and letters show a grim arithmetic of space and mortality. Some captains argued that giving space raised survival rates and therefore eventual profit. Others prioritized numbers. The result, regardless of calculation, was the same: little air, a damp floor, and the constant percussion of bodies shifting when the ship pitched. You remember the first food. The crew threw down wooden bowls, a thin stew, sometimes thickened with rice or beans kept for the passage, sometimes only watery gruel. Water was rationed into barrels that fumed when opened. Men on deck drank first, then the crew, then those below if any was left. When the sea is kind, the provisions hold. When storms come, barrels rot and the smell changes. Disease follows. Dysentery, smallpox, scurvy. These are not words in your mouth yet, only the ache in a gut and the shaking fever that steals sleep. Voices keep the world. You do not speak the Portuguese of the crew and slave traders, though a few words may be offered. A command, a joke, a prod. Many of those aboard speak languages the record names: Kimbundu, Kikongo, Umbundu, Yoruba, Akan. Ship logs sometimes note lingua for convenience, an attempt to tally what might matter at market. When more than one language is present, new ways of speaking emerge: sign, rhythm, a shared word for water or fire. From the archives, we know enslaved people often found each other through song, through remembered prayers, through small devotional objects carried in pockets or hidden beneath clothing. The sea is a syllabus of weather. Crossing the equator brings a change. Sailors mark it with ritual, a noisy rite that has nothing to do with those below. Storms are another story. A squall presses the ship's rails. The deck is a sheet of motion, and below, close air becomes a knife. The ship seeks the shortest route, but shortest can mean fighting the doldrums, unexpected calms, or the long sweep past the Cape of Good Hope. Each a ledger item in time and lives. On deck, space smells of pitch and brine and human exertion. Below, the hold smells of history, the things people take when they leave one home and do not expect to return. Sometimes a charm, a bead string, a scrap of cloth with a familiar pattern. These small things become anchors. Courts later record their appearance at sales or in legal disputes. In some slaving voyages, women kept infants strapped to them. Others were separated at the markets. The archival record is mercilessly practical. Names are rare, ages often estimated, lineage erased into hands on a ledger. Violence has shape. Past the stench and sickness lies the discipline of the deck. The whip, the deck-confined punishment, the isolating box known in some logs as the caliphate. Yet the sources also show resistance in quieter forms. A sudden refusal to eat, a coordinated scream to draw attention, or the coordination of the few who could risk bargaining with crew for water. There were a number of uprisings recorded in Portuguese sources. Some were suppressed at sea, some led to violent retribution ashore. The archives cannot capture the private bargains struck in the dark, but they record consequences. Where are you bound? Records show the largest destination for Portuguese ships was Brazil, Salvador in Bahia, the sugar plantations of Pernambuco, and the growing ports of Rio de Janeiro. There, a life's geography changes again. The auction block, the assignment to a plantation or a household, the pulsing of a new market. But before any sale, the sea writes its first claim. Mortality rates on some voyages were staggeringly high. Letters from merchants to their correspondents note the loss of cargo and grieve at the loss of price. We must always remember, archives count human lives as units of value. That is the ledger's cruelty. You think of the nights when the crew sang in coarse stanzas, a call and response that set the ship's labor to rhythm. You imagine, too, the hush that fell when someone below began to tell a memory of a home. A river in a remembered language, a smell of smoke from a hearth. Those fragments, not full stories, but shards, survive in depositions and in the notes of missionaries and abolitionists who later recorded testimony. They are often small, a songline, a name, a phrase. Yet they are the threads we can trace back. We do not know the person who speaks here. There is no single buried manuscript with name and date waiting to be opened. Instead, there are many buried voices, and the act of reconstruction is an ethical one, to render their sensations without inventing biographies. This voice will keep to what the record permits, the sensory landscape, the rhythms of a voyage, the documented places and practices, and when we imagine the particular, we will mark it as a reconstruction. By the third night at sea, a sound rises different from the ocean's steady moan. A single cough, sharp and unexpected. It starts among the children, then moves like a rumor. Men on deck notice the way the crew crosses themselves. Below, the light through the hatch seems thinner. The first fever is a threshold. The ship's surgeon, if one is aboard, writes in his log. The crew measures losses in body count and time. The ledger adds another line, a rustle on the deck, then a shouted order. The hatches are battened more tightly than before. The sea will take the rest of the day, but for those below, a new ledger opens. Who will live? Who will die? Who will see the auction blocks of Salvador? The hold breathes out a long, small sound, a chorus of fear and a fragment of song. The cough grows, small and animal at first, then it runs like rumor along the cramped benches. Surgeons on slaving voyages were unevenly trained, sometimes a barber surgeon, sometimes an enlisted crewman with a handful of remedies, and their logs survive in fragments, lists of fevers, wounds, and the occasional crude diagnosis. On many ships, the surgeon's notes read like a business record: fever, days sick, dead. The captain keeps the ledger because mortality is a calculation of loss, and in the grim arithmetic of trade, lives are numbered as hands and units. You feel the surgeon's hands before you see them, cool, efficient, smelling faintly of wine and cloth. He probes a child's belly, presses a wrist for pulse, mumbles a word you do not understand. His remedies are kitchen science: wine, vinegar, poultices of herbs when the crew can spare them. When a case cannot be saved, the crew wraps the body in canvas or sailcloth, binds it with rope, adds a weight of iron, and walks the corpse up the companionway. Burial at sea is practiced and public. Men on deck turn their faces away while the body is committed to the deep. The ritual is mechanical, but grief does not obey ceremony. Disease moves in human rhythms. Dysentery robs strength with a unrelenting violence. Scurvy dims the gums and loosens teeth. Smallpox marks the skin and sometimes kills outright. Missionary reports and port hospital lists name these illnesses clinically, but the lived reality is the night groan, children clinging to laps, an elder's hand finding a hair braid and smoothing it. On some voyages, the death toll is staggering. Merchants' letters dryly note many hands lost, as if tallying husks instead of people. Language changes while the ship crosses water. Men and women from different regions, Kimbundu, Kikongo, Yoruba, Akan, find ways to fashion common speech. A phrase for water, a rhythm to call a movement, a shared prayer become tools of survival. Assemblies of song and whispered names stitch a fragile social fabric. These are not comforts only but practical speech, coordinating tasks in the pitch of the ship and keeping panic from spreading when the deck tilts and the light is a thin slit. Tenderness appears in small, risky gestures. Crew members sometimes smuggle an extra portion of food. An older woman teaches a youngster a leaf's name and how to make a poultice. These acts appear in the archival margins, a missionary note, a legal deposition, the odd line in a merchant's letter, and they complicate the ledger, revealing that relationships aboard were not purely instrument and commodity. Uprisings happen and are recorded. Revolts are born of desperation and an ethical logic that resists ownership. When they occur, crews answer with muskets, boarding pikes, and brutal repression. The archives describe some uprisings crushed at sea. Others end in executions or punishments at the next port. At times, negotiation substitutes for violence. Promises of water, a few loosened shackles, or a change in packing can restore a brittle calm. Historical records are clearer on consequences than on the private strategies captives used to survive. The ship carries ritual as well as cargo. Deck crews mark the equator with a boisterous rite, a ceremony that has nothing to do with those below, but shapes the vessel's temperament. Sailors' rituals, sometimes cruel, sometimes comic, are part of the vessel's social weather. A captain's mood on any given morning can spell the difference between a measured ration and a withheld bucket of water. The smallest whim echoes in the hold where thirst is immediate and unforgiving. Children change the geometry of the hold. An infant strapped to a mother's breast anchors a cluster of bodies. A toddler's wail will alter the crew's mood for an afternoon. Mothers cradle, hum, and pass on names and small medicines. Port records sometimes note the ages of children sold and list mothers as separate lots. The paperwork is blunt. Memory keeps the lullabies. Skills survive the crossing. Men who had been fishermen, cloth workers, potters, or herders arrive with capacities visible to owners and auctioneers. Good with cattle, experienced in sewing, strong hand for field work, appear in tallies. These notes shape immediate fate after sale, where someone is placed and how they will be used. Yet they are also private ledgers of dignity that trade tried to erase. Provisions and rot are constant concerns. Salted food sours when barrels are breached. Rats, the ship's shadow animals, scavenge the margins. When storms pull at the rigging and the sea becomes a white confusion, water tanks slosh and barrels swell, and sickness follows in the mud. Ship's logs record lost barrels. Merchant letters calculate the added cost. Those calculations matter. Every rotten barrel is fewer calories for those below. At night, the hold's dark becomes a place for remembering. Someone drums on a beam with a knuckle or a hide-wrapped stone. Another answers with a sung line that sounds like a river, and for a few minutes the hold is a riverbank again. These moments, small, fragile, fiercely human, persist in missionary interviews and in the scant testimonies that filtering institutions preserved. As the months pass, patterns harden. Bodies buried at sea, songs braided into a faint common tongue, the ledger column thickening with dead and sold. Men on deck argue charts while below, hands smooth a blanket around a sleeping child who will not wake. Both are real. Both are part of the crossing's fact. At dawn, someone on watch points to a green line on the horizon. For an instant, hope and dread hold hands. Land means the end of the sea, but also the auction. Below, a woman clasps a cloth amulet to her chest and hums a fragment of home. Above, the captain clamps an order into the log. The ship prepares to change one kind of market for another, and the questions of survival shift into questions of sale and new masters. The long-expected shore arrives not as spectacle, but as a slow widening of light. From the hatch you see roped docks, the gray sweep of a port, and the small, precise geometry of humans moving on cobbles. A new air presses down the companionway, salt, mixed with smoke, citrus, horse, and leather. The smell of a place where markets are already breathing. The ship's crew moves with practiced urgency. Plankings are fixed, seals accounted, lists checked. For those below, the same motions mean a different ledger is about to open. You climb the ladder by force or by order. The first sight of the quay is disorienting. Men shouting in Portuguese, ropes creaking, the flash of irons on a captain's belt, and the unexpected color of clothing, bright, clean, and foreign. Near the wharf are holding pens, low buildings and fenced yards where newly arrived captives are kept before sail. Sometimes these are improvised, sometimes they are permanent complexes owned by merchants. Port notaries and municipal registries preserve inventories and sometimes note provenance, ages, and supposed skills. Such lists read like a market catalog with human names stripped to shorthand. Inspection is a kind of violence with its own vocabulary. Buyers walk the line, prodding limbs, counting teeth, assessing muscle and steadiness. Merchants call out supposed skills and the ship's origin as if provenance were a commodity label. The act is public and ritualized, a crowd's murmur, a child's soft cry, the white glare of sun. Archives often note, in a few blunt words, suitable for field, house service, or good with cattle, phrases that mask the person behind them. Baptismal registers offer one of the clearer traces of identity remade at this point. Catholic parishes recorded many baptisms. Sometimes enslaved people received Christian names by priests or masters. These records are complex evidence. They show how markets sought to fit bodies into colonial legal frameworks, while sometimes preserving a sliver of individual history. At times, baptisms were voluntary. At others, they were coerced to secure legal standing or obedient labor. Church documents therefore appear in the archival record as both instruments of control and occasional rare attestations of personhood. The auction compresses a life into minutes. The auctioneer's cadence is practiced, sharp, rhythmic, designed to prompt bids. Those who speak Portuguese find the proceedings slightly less alien. Those who do not rely on gestures and the interpreter's crude work. Clothes are examined, limbs flexed, and an exposed body becomes a public ledger. Memories land like pebbles in a pocket, a river's bend, a name whispered, a small charm kept hidden. These are the private archives that rarely make it into official pages, yet they endure in fragments recorded by missionaries, abolitionists, and the rare deposition. Assignment dictates fate. Some are sent to a plantation's senzala, the communal quarters near an engenho, the sugar mill, others to urban households or docks. Plantation labor is grueling and regimented. Early starts in the cane fields, the snap of machetes, the pungent smell of crushed cane in boiling vats. Urban service may spare the worst of field toil, but demands unrelenting proximity to masters' expectations. Cooking, washing, carrying, and constant vigilance. Arrival at an ingenio transforms the senses. The sound of millstones grinding becomes a distant mechanical heartbeat. Smoke from the boiling house hangs like a permanent weather. The air tastes of molasses and ash. The senzala is often a long, crowded room with earthen floor and thin bedding. Heat pools in the corners and insects make nighttime a chorus. In town, kitchens are hot and sharp with the scent of frying oil and citrus. The city's market presses close, a different kind of exposure. People sustain themselves with memory and small, steady acts of preservation. Women hide seeds and herbs, planting secret plots of cassava or greens near the quarters. Men may fashion tools or mend nets in the margins. Oral traditions, songs, lullabies, work call melodies become rehearsal for survival, carrying names and prayers across languages. Missionary memoirs and later testimonies often note these exchanges. Fragments of songlines, a ritual snatch of prayer, recipes for poultices, and the names of roots that ease a fever. These acts of cultural care are quiet but persistent defiance. Resistance takes many shapes. Some attempted to escape to the hinterlands, where maroon communities, quilombos, formed in dense landscapes and offered refuge and a different political life. Others resisted within plantation life, slowing work, breaking tools, refusing quotas, or forging solidarity through shared worship and mutual aid. Sabotage and subtle non-cooperation were common survival strategies. Colonial officials frequently recorded such acts with alarm, showing that one of slavery's vulnerabilities was the constant, everyday refusal to be fully contained. The law frames life. Colonial statutes define status, punishment, and the legal conditions of sale and ownership. Records include debates about mortality and the costs of voyages. Officials sometimes argued for regulations aimed at limiting death rates because cargo loss was economically damaging. Yet law on paper often failed to restrain local violence, where an overseer's temperament or a plantation's quotas overshadowed distant statutes. The archives show regulations and the frequent gap between written rule and lived reality. Children and motherhood reshape the work's rhythm. Infants are held close, sometimes strapped to a mother's back with cloth. A child's cry can change a day's calculus about rations or watch assignments. Registers sometimes list ages and note nursing mothers, but the archival emphasis is on market value rather than tenderness. Private accounts preserved in missionary or court records tell of lullabies and names, small acts of tenderness that tethered people to remembered homes and resisted the erasure attempted by trade. Days turn into routines, water drawn at dawn, the overseer's whistle marking beginning and end, long arcs of sun that measure all labor. Food is often meager, corn porridge, salted fish, bitter greens, supplemented when possible by hidden gardens or foraged roots. Medical care is limited. The knowledge of a plantation midwife, a surgeon called in for a broken limb, or nothing at all. Disease and injury become part of the grim arithmetic of daily life. At dusk in the senzala, voices gather in muted patterns. Someone drums a rhythm on an empty pot. Another answers with a hummed melody that sounds like a river. These nocturnes are not merely comfort. They are a language of memory and planning. In one corner, an elder teaches a child a word in a mother tongue. Elsewhere, a pair exchanges seeds wrapped in cloth. Outside, a distant drumbeat, faint, intermittent, may signal a nearby maroon camp or a market where news travels. Listeners hold their breath, measuring the distance between safety and the chance of movement. A new day rises and the overseer's silhouette moves across the yard. The plantation's work call sounds, and with it comes a quiet decision made in many hearts, to wait and endure, or to seek the path that leaves behind the known cruelty. The tension tightens. You step down a narrow path at dawn, mud soft underfoot, heart a drum you try to name. The plantation's boundary thins into scrub and then into real forest, an edge that smells of green sap, rotting leaves, and a kind of newness you have only imagined in memory. Behind you, the plantation's whistle, the distant call of a master's voice, the clank of someone counting hands. Ahead, a rumor of drums, a darker canopy, and the promise that breath can be taken without being measured. Running feels like a decision made twice, once in the moment you leave the senzala, and again in the quiet calculation of distance, hunger, and danger. Maps of the time are blunt instruments. Travelers and officials wrote of dense forests, of mountain ranges that threw off the pursuing tracks, and of marshes where horses would sink. Escapes were never purely solitary affairs. People ran alone and in small bands. Some fled toward the coastline and ships that might carry them elsewhere. Others sought the hills and remoter river valleys where maroon communities, quilombos, had established themselves. Quilombos were more than hideouts. They were settlements with politics, trade, and strategies for survival. The best known of these was the confederation that colonial records call Palmares, a collection of villages in the northeastern backlands. Palmares, and others like it, drew together people from different African origins, indigenous allies, and sometimes even disaffected Europeans. They grew food, crafted tools, and mounted sustained resistance. The archival traces, military reports, missionary letters, slave catcher manifests are partial and charged, but they show that maroon polities could endure for decades and, in some cases, for generations. You enter a quilombo at mid-morning. The air is thick with smoke from hearths where cassava is being ground and roasted. The ground is packed with footprints and the soft impressions of moccasins, but there are also recently tilled furrows and the neat rows of a garden plot tendered at the edge. Huts cluster in a pattern that suggests deliberate planning, a common yard for gatherings, a slightly elevated platform where leaders hold council, and the woven fences that help mark territory. Children run barefoot and confident, braided hair sprinkled with clay as if for protection. The soundscape is layered: drums, a woman's high call, the rattle of a grinding stone, laughter that remembers a different riverbank. Governance inside these communities varies. Some quilombos had clear leadership, elected or earned through the charisma of elder fighters and organizers. Others operated by councils and consensus among elders, warriors, and women with specific knowledge of healing and cultivation. Oral histories and the fragments of colonial testimony suggest that decisions about raids, diplomacy, and daily resource allocation were often communal. Many communities balanced defense with production. They cultivated manioc and maize, raised small herds where possible, and organized raids to seize supplies or free captives from outlying plantations. Food is an immediate politics of survival. Inside a quilombo, you taste cassava prepared in several ways, mashed into fuba, baked in hot coals, or pounded into a dough that holds when boiled. You learn quickly that there are precise techniques to remove the root's bitter poison, to grate, to squeeze, to roast. There are also stores of wild fruits and taught foraged knowledge passed down by elders who remember river eddies far from here. Coffee, sugar, and salted fish do appear when traded or raided, but the backbone of daily life is local and resilient. Gardens, small animal pens, and preservation techniques born of memory and adaptation. Religion and ritual shape the community's moral weather. Syncretic practices arise as people from different African cosmovisions translate names and spirits into new phrases, sometimes grafting Catholic saints onto older deities as a practical camouflage against missionary surveillance. The drum patterns encode work songs, calls to prayer, and signals for alarm. Night gatherings involve storytelling and the passing of names, memory work that keeps genealogies alive even when official registries have erased them. These are political acts. To remember a name is to claim a past and to refuse erasure. Defense is never far from daily life. Palisades and lookouts are practical constructions. Scouts teach children to listen for the wrong bird sound that signals riders on the trail. Warriors train with what they have, machetes, pikes, guns acquired through trade or raids, and build strategies that play to local knowledge, ambushes in narrow passes, false trails that confuse trackers, and night attacks designed to disrupt patrol patterns. Colonial records detail repeated expeditions by banderantes, militia, and colonial troops, sometimes led by hired indigenous trackers, who attacked quilombos with varying degrees of brutality and success. The quilombo's survival often depends on mobility, secrecy, and alliances. Alliances are delicate and surprising. Indigenous groups sometimes trade with maroons. There are recorded instances of shared food exchanges and marriages that knit kinship across difference. Merchants sometimes make informal bargains to obtain goods from quilombos. In other moments, colonial authorities seek treaties, agreements that might end or postpone conflict by offering land or freedom under specific terms. These negotiations are fraught. Acceptance could mean survival under new rules, refusal could mean further violence. The historical record records both outcomes, the endurance of some communities and the tragic destruction of others. Life inside also means innovation. People invent tools, rework clothing, and maintain crafts that colonial authorities tried to suppress. Songs mutate into work calls and into signals for organizing collective labor. Medicinal knowledge holds the community together in times of illness when no colonial surgeon will come. The presence of women as organizers, healers, and negotiators is a constant in the records we have, though the archives often understate their centrality. Women managed food stores, mediated disputes, and preserved ritual lines that maintain memory and cohesion. You learn the names of leaders not through a single manuscript, but through scattered mentions across reports. A name appearing in a raid report, the notation in a bondage register that someone escaped to Palmares, a martyr's tale in a missionary account. In one well-known arc, the figure who later is called Zumbi emerges as a symbol of resistance in the late 17th century, a leader associated with Palmares who becomes a rallying memory for later generations. We must treat these names with care. Colonial documents can misname, misdate, or flatten complex political structures into single-person mythologies. Still, the persistence of a name across reports signals that the quilombo's organization had indelible effect. A strategy often used by quilombos was to exploit the plantation economy's logistics. Raiding isolated holdings for food or horses is both survival and a form of economic warfare. These acts forced planters to divert resources for defense, raise the cost of slave hunting, and sometimes opened bargaining space. Colonial officials responded with punitive expeditions and negotiated pardons alike. The balance between repression and negotiation shaped the landscape. Some quilombos were driven deeper into marginal lands. Others grew more visible and politically salient. Tonight, drums rise in a pattern that is not purely celebratory. The elders are meeting by the tallest tree near the palisade. Young men and women stand at the edges, faces lit by a thin fire. News from scouts arrives, a column of riders seen a day's march west, carrying the colors of a colonial militia. The community holds a quiet count. Supplies, scouts, elders, and the children who must be moved. You feel the same raw currency you felt aboard the ship. Planning, fear, and the hope that knowledge of the land will bend fate. The council's voice is low and precise. Decisions will be made about movement, defense, and which stores to burn if capture seems inevitable. Outside, the wind carries a distant, sharp sound. Horses, or perhaps merely the bark of a dog. The small, careful life you have entered braces. The council moves with the economy of long practice. Few words, many small signs. Women fold cloth, elders gather pots, and the young check children's feet for blisters. The plan is not a flight of panic, but a choreography. Who carries the seed bags? Who hides the grinding stones? Which elders go first to keep the trails honest? There is no single leader whose decree dissolves into obedience. Authority arrives through remembered competence. Who knows the river fording? Who can read the bird calls? Who has the maps of foot trails kept in their head? You leave at dusk. The air feels like cloth, thick, folding around shoulders and faces. The drums do not stop. Now they are part signal and part lullaby, marking route and pace. The palisade slips behind like a human tide folding into forest. Night holds a different sensibility here. The land is both opaque and instructive. In daylight, a trail can be followed. At night, it becomes a music of scents. Gamboge flowers crushed underfoot, a coal smoke drift from a distant farmhouse, a frog chorus that gives you the low pulse of marsh. The scouts lead by scent and memory, their feet moving with the surety of people who know how the land wears weather. At first light, you stop at a small river bend where the water runs clearer than you might expect. Someone, an elder with a scarred wrist, teaches you how to read the stones, which will give underweight, which hide slow eddies that swallow small things. You wash a cloth and fold it into a parcel, then watch children drum fingers on knees until the river's sound unfurls into tasks, washing, retying bundles, trading soft jokes that ease the tightness in chests. The quilombo's economy is not only subsistence, it is the art of use. Woven mats patched like old maps, pottery repaired with paste and elbow, seeds counted with the sort of exactness that becomes prayer. You learn the logic of avoidance. Patrols follow roads and tracks. They rarely leave a beaten path unless ordered. So, the quilombo's scouts move by knotted paths and animal corridors, making small, deceptive trails that break and rejoin the landscape. The tracker's craft is a mixture of patience and camouflage, fainting fields with the scattering of leaves, leaving false footprints that suggest animals rather than men. This is not mere trickery. It is survival science, and it is taught in patient repetitions. Sometimes the patrols find them. The first skirmish you meet is not a thunder of cavalry, but a sullen, sharp quarrel between two groups who misread one another's signals. A young man trips a snare, a dog barks, and the alarms go up. Men grab machetes, a few throw stones, and someone fires a gun obtained months earlier from a trader. The sound is immediate and terrible, cutting through the morning air. A woman runs forward to pull a child away. The child's cry knits the combat into a moment of human panic. The patrol, surprised, falls back into bush. Afterwards, the smell of burnt hair lingers, and someone mops a wound with a green leaf and a whispered prayer. Loss reshapes everything. After the skirmish, you count: food stores used, a field trampled, a hut lost. The child's fever returns. Later you learn he will not wake. Funerary practice in the quilombo is both practical and profoundly personal. The body is wrapped in cloth, herbs laid inside, and songs intoned that stitch the person back into a remembered river. The elders speak names aloud, and sometimes they speak the names in the old language that officials ignore, as if saying the name aloud ensures someone saw them whole. Mourning becomes strategy, how to move with fewer hands, which plots to abandon, which seedlings to bury, and which to keep. Victory and reprieve are fragile. Weeks pass with the careful measures of provisioning. The community scouts a plantation yard under dawn light and returns with sacks of corn obtained as part of a negotiated exchange. Another group brings a cask of salted fish, taken during a confused skirmish at a coastal settlement. These gains are always shadowed by risk. A raid that yields food today may invite a larger punitive expedition tomorrow. The quilombo's leaders trade in time, How long will a store hold? How far can children be hidden? When will the militia next muster? The sense of kinship intensifies under pressure. New marriages occur quietly, sometimes as quick pledges in the edge camps where couples bind cord and name one another under a tree. Children, born on the run or raised in the hinterland, learn to read land as if it were a book. Old songs are stitched into new lyrics, and the drumwork that once accompanied a harvest now signals a watch rotation. These cultural acts are not romantic. They are techniques of survival. They create continuity in a life that violence attempts to fracture. The colonial response grows. Merchants pressure governors. Rural planters form riding parties called banderas, and sometimes allied indigenous groups are hired to track escapees. Reports come to the quilombo of bounties and of detachments mustering with horses and chains. Diplomacy becomes an occasional instrument, a treaty offered in exchange for land rights, or a promise of amnesty for those who return. These offers are dangerous. To accept may mean losing the autonomy the quilombo has fought for. To refuse is to invite further repression. In the rain, you bury a hidden cache in the roots of a fig tree, a pot of seeds wrapped in oilcloth and tied with vine. The act is small but sacramental. To hide food is to postpone starvation and to preserve memory. You also teach children songs that encode directions, left at the termite mound, right where the red lichen forms a cross, so that if capture scatters families, the map lives on inside the mouth of a child. Practical pedagogy becomes an instrument of resistance. Time brings also a slow sense of possibility. News drifts from the cities, debates about slave control measures, religious debates about the morality of the trade, and the occasional rumor of an amnesty offered to those who adopt Catholic names and submit to a master. The quilombo watches these shifts with patient skepticism. They have learned that paper in a distant office can be less binding than a musket and the hot breath of a horse. On a late morning that smells of warm earth, scouts report smoke on the horizon, thin at first, then thicker, and then unmistakable. It is not the smoke of a cook fire, but of a larger movement, a column of men with banners in the distance, black specks moving with the hard cadence of militia. The elders close council and sharpen blades. Children are brought to the deepest shelters. The drumbeat tightens. You sense the old arithmetic again. Fight, flee, negotiate. Each choice carries its own catalog of losses. The column moves like a black seam across the morning light. First, a scatter of riders, then a denser line that swallows the horizon. From the Palisades Ridge you can see the glint of metal where the sun catches gun harness and the white flash of a standard. The scouts' faces are grave but not surprised. The quilombo has known this rhythm before. A raised price in the markets, a raid a week later, a militia mustering with horses and pointed pikes. What is new is always the scale and the particular fury of the men who ride. Inside the community the mood is purposeful. Children are quickly reassigned, some to hidden caches, others to trusted elders whose footprints are the least likely to betray direction. Baskets of smoking cassava are broken into smaller parcels. Pots are inverted and used to muffle steps. Women move like a practiced current through the compound. Fast hands, eyes low, voices clipped to measured syllables. The smoke from kitchen fires thickens into a thin, defensive haze that will help disguise movement at a distance. The elders convene under the same fig tree where seeds were hidden days ago. They weigh scouts' reports, the size of the force, the presence of firearms, whether trackers are included, and the likely line of approach. Historical reports show colonial expeditions often combined mounted planters, hired indigenous trackers, and the occasional Portuguese militia unit, men familiar with the terrain and practiced at hunting fugitives. The quilombo's planners know this. A frontal defense risks cavalry. An ambush in narrow terrain favors local knowledge. Decisions are pragmatic and quick. Some families will pack and must toward the river's reed beds where boats might hide them. Others will stay, preparing to defend the central yard and the granaries. There is no single heroic stand scripted by some foreign chronicle, only choices made between limited options, each with its own cost. A child's hand slips into yours. You feel the weight of responsibility, a gravity that has been teaching you how to measure risk by the light of small things. At first, contact the attacker's probe. A rider appears on a ridge and fires a pistol, more for alarm than accuracy. In the heat of early engagement, the quilombo's scouts use every advantage of the land. False tracks lead pursuers into marshy bends. Thorn lines hide pits. A row of smoke signals warns of a flank movement. Men with machetes and pikes hug trees and wait for the column to enter a choke point. The sound is sudden and immediate. A volley, the crack of muskets, a shout, a small, terrified scramble as an animal bolt startles through a vegetable plot. Combat here is intimate. It is not a line of two armies, but a sequence of skirmishes where one person's quick cut can ruin a pursuer's horse, and buy a family the 5 minutes needed to disappear. Colonial reports repeatedly emphasize that Maroons used the terrain in surprise. They also document the savage reprisals when militia caught them. That architecture of asymmetric warfare shapes both the quilombo's tactics and the colonial response. An organized raid can burn a hut, but cannot easily eradicate movement or memory embedded in the land. In one narrow pass, the fighting is fierce and close. A young man, no single name survives in our imagined speaker's ledger, only the presence of a brave body, steps forward with a pike and holds the line long enough for an elder to push a cache of seeds into a hollow stump, and for a small group of children to slip along a hidden trail. The smell of wet earth and gunpowder hangs heavy. Someone cries out. A dog barks and then is silent. A woman uses a boiled root poultice on a bleeding thigh, her hands steady, her voice a low, constant count that keeps others moving. The militia, when repelled from one approach, reconfigures. They send flankers, they deploy dogs, they use burning torches to drive smoke into the compounds. Colonial papers describe these tactics, burning fences, surrounding huts, and pressing smoke to force people into open ground. Because if fire can clear the shelter, the quilombo's advantage in concealment is blunted. The defenders use quick counter-moves. They shift sleeping sites, they feint, they leave a small group in view, while most melt away down subterranean paths. Losses mount. After a day of back and forth, you count the wounded. A man with a buckshot in the shoulder, a child with a fever from a dust scrape that will fester, a hut with charred beams. The oral fragments that colonial witnesses later preserved speak of grief that is fierce and private. A woman who will not let the militia carry away the body of her brother without scratching the earth with her fingers in protest. An old man who covers hymns into the night so children can sleep. These human acts, grief, defiance, tenderness, are the unrecorded counterpoint to the official logs of damage. When capture occurs, it is rarely the clean roundup the merchants wanted. Some Maroons are seized in the skirmish, others are betrayed by poor roads or by local informants promised reward. Captured people are often marched to the nearest plantation or fortified town, where the legal apparatus catches up. A hearing, a notation in the municipal ledger, sometimes a hurried sale that disperses families. Colonial administration used both legal process and extrajudicial punishment. The archival truth is agonizingly bureaucratic and brutally efficient. Yet, escape remains a living possibility. Many who fled earlier generations had kin in remote creeks and islands. Others found passage on pirated boats, hidden with fishermen, or clandestinely boarded vessels leaving for distant ports. The Atlantic itself remained a corridor not only for the trade, but occasionally for flight. Records of Maroons sometimes show furtive coastal movements and alliances with lower-profile traders, willing to help in secret for payment or sympathy. These fugitive trajectories complicate the neat binaries of capture and enslavement. At dusk on the second day, the column seems to withdraw. Reports will later differ. Some colonial letters claim victory, others note the high cost and the failure to secure all fugitives. The quilombo, meanwhile, counts losses and measures what to abandon. A small group returns to gather hidden pots under heavy cloud, another to fetch the child left under a rocker. The elders speak in low tones about whether to stay near the ruined palisade or to fold into a new route. Either choice will write a new string in the family's memory. You gather into a tight knot of survivors around a near ruin as the rain starts, fine, stinging, and the drumming shifts from the earlier urgent call to a slow dirge. The smell of wet earth and burnt wood mixes with the tang of cassava. A girl places a broken bead into an elder's palm. He nods as if the bead were a sacrament. The drumbeat becomes a counting of breaths. Out in the distance, a rider slows and scans the tree line. He looks less like the earlier charged horseman and more like an emissary, mounted but alone, holding a small white flag. Whether he approaches to negotiate, to scout, or to deliver a formal pardon is impossible to know without the colonial record's footnote. Sometimes emissaries came bearing offers of land, sometimes threats. The figure's halt creates a new possibility that folds into all the accumulated fear and hope. Talk, treaty, trick, or trap. You hold your breath with the rest of the community. The future for many of you will be decided in a few minutes. A choice that will ripple into auctions, boats, law, or refuge. The rider dismounts, boots whispering against packed earth as he pulls the white flag taut. He walks into the open, the militia a smudge on the ridge, and bows with a formal, practiced motion. The emissary smells of dust and horse. His uniform is sun-faded. He speaks Portuguese. His offer is simple and dangerous. Land if they return as tenants, a pardon for those who surrender, and an oath of non-retaliation if certain leaders are handed over. The words are soft and rehearsed. The threat under them is not. The elders exchange glances beneath the fig tree. They have heard offers like this before, promises that paper often fails to keep. The camp's ledger is not ink but memory. Raids that returned with burning, treaties that dissolved when local men of power decided otherwise, a history of broken guarantees. Still, the offer forces urgent arithmetic, children's bellies, stores that are running thin, the specter of a larger punitive expedition. A negotiator steps forward, someone who once traded with port merchants and knows weight, measure, and the trap of legal language. She lays conditions that are practical and moral, protection for children, recognition of communal plots, and non-separation of families. The emissary produces a sealed note, official phrasing promising land or tax status. He asks for names. There is a hush. Naming leaders risks sale. Withholding names risks a larger raid. Negotiations stretch into the night. The council's work is not rhetorical flourish, but difficult arithmetic. What secures the most lives? Some argue for acceptance as a temporary shelter that will allow the community to feed its children. Others warn that a legal umbrella offered by a colonizer is rain on thin cloth. The young fighters bristle at any hint of surrender. Elders count seeds and assess the cost of being settled into small plots under outsiders' jurisdiction. In the end, they craft a compromise. They will accept a narrow agreement, certain communal plots recognized, children to be spared direct sale, and no handing over of elders' names. The emissary writes terms in a rough hand, and a mourning ritual follows, crosses, signatures, the parish priest's presence, binding this fragile settlement with church and ink. The signing is quiet. Hands shake, a song threads through, and children grip parcels of cassava like talismans. The treaty buys time, but it also changes the metrics of survival. For weeks, enforcement seems partial. Municipal officials record the pact. Merchants grumble but comply where it suits them. Yet the colonial apparatus is porous. Local planters, resentful, begin to work around the agreement. One refuses to accept pardoned hands, claiming they undercut his labor market. Disputes arrive as petitions to town halls, where justice is as likely to be purchased as found. You see how law becomes another tool in the ledger. The quilombo now must defend a paper promise in rooms where Portuguese and merchants speak a language of accounts. Envoys trade petitions and bribes. Visits to municipal clerks become necessary. Meanwhile, everyday life presses on. Children learn to weave mats, elders tend hidden gardens, and midwives preserve knowledge of roots and poultices. The treaty's paper is both shelter and new frontier of negotiation. Small violations widen the treaty's edges. A child is seized in a nighttime raid by a man who claims ignorance. An adjacent parcel of land is quietly annexed by a planter who argues old boundary rights. Each infraction prompts a response. Envoys dispatched to negotiate, petitions filed, sometimes a swift raid to reclaim a taken plot. These acts of legal and extra-legal contest wear at the community's reserves and patience. When merchants arrive with a new demand, buyers from a coastal town seeking hands of a certain skill, the fragile treaty faces commerce's blunt force. A young potter's name is eyed by a trader who sees profit. The elders bristle, recalling the ship's auction block as an ever-present fact. They file a legal protest, but the wheels of municipal justice turn slowly, clogged by vested interests. The community balances between sustained legal struggle and the old forms of flight that once saved them. Night drumming shifts from memory to planning. The council maps routes and whispers, teaches children in coded directions, left at the termite mound, right past the river route, and hides a last reserve of seed in a hollow log. If law fails, land and memory must hold them, routes, songs, and the names passed in low voices. These techniques, small, cunning, and durable, are the quilombo's true capital. Then news arrives of a hearing scheduled in town to adjudicate the merchant's claim. The colonial court represents a different kind of battlefield: ink and witnesses, interpreters, and bribes. Every page filed there could be a step toward enforced sale or a line in a legal victory. The community must decide: continue to use the legal tools of the colonizers, risk exposure and possible betrayal, or abandon the treaty and disappear deeper into the interior. The choice presses against bodies and bowls. Some will stay and fight with words and signatures. Others will gather what they can and move at dawn, embracing the hidden roads whose maps live only in song. As you listen beside the fig tree, the drums slow and then quicken, the heartbeat of a people weighing law against land, a ledger of paper against the memory of ships and auction blocks. Outside, the town bell tolls a hollow time, each knell another reminder that the colonial world keeps counting, in markets and municipal ledgers. Inside the quilombo, families pack, elders count, and the youngest are lulled with songs that double as directions. The day of the hearing draws near, and with it the risk that the legal instruments designed to secure will instead be used to dismantle all that the community has built. The drumbeat tightens once more as the council disperses to make last preparations. What the next sun will bring, courtroom, raid, flight, or something else, is a question that will bind the community's fate to the city's ink and the ocean's old ledger. Dawn is a thin bruise of light when the small delegation leaves the quilombo for town. 3 elders, a woman who once traded at the port and knows how to read a merchant's face, and a young man whose steady hands have mended pottery and who will serve as a witness to skills. They move with purposeful slowness, cloaked in patched cloaks and carrying a bundle of petition papers wrapped in oilcloth. The path to the municipal hall twists through sugarcane and scrub, then opens onto the cobbled approach where the town announces itself. A church tower, a courthouse facade, and the low murmur of market voices already at work. Town is a different grammar. The air smells of frying oil, cattle, and ink. Merchants pace the square with ledgers underarms, planters mount horses with a practiced weight, and municipal clerks call names and hand out receipts. The municipal building is cool and dark inside, smelling faintly of damp parchment and beeswax from sealed documents. The courtroom, if it can be called that, is a rectangular room with benches for citizens, a raised dais for the judge or magistrate, and a long wooden table where witnesses and notaries place their papers. Whitewashed walls display the cross and an official seal whose paint has been scuffed by decades of business. Courts in colonial towns are procedures folded into daily life, not merely sites of justice, but marketplaces of influence. Officials are men who trade petitions as routinely as merchants trade sugar. Testimony is shaped by social weight, by how well someone knows a clerk, and by the invisible currency of gifts slipped into pockets. The quilombo's negotiator knows this and has come prepared. Baptismal entries, a copy of the town's earlier agreement, inked in a priest's hand, and a list of elders who claim tenure on communal plots. These are documents the record keepers recognize. Still, the room favors those with shorthand and swagger. Planters mint a presence by arriving with mounted escorts and witnesses called good men because their names mean social weight. The hearing begins with formalities. The magistrate reads the merchant's claim aloud, that certain named individuals are the property of a coastal buyer, asserted to be obtained from the ship's manifest or from a prior sale. The merchant's voice is steady and practiced. He points to a notary's seal from a previous month and calls for enforcement of market rights. On the bench, the magistrate leans and asks for proof of the quilombo's title to the very people it protects. The quilombo's woman produces the signed treaty, a baptismal register listing some of the community by Christian names and ages, and testimony translated by her port contacts. Translation itself becomes a battleground. Interpreters, often crewmen or port clerks, render names into Portuguese and sometimes into shorthand that loses nuance. Words from the old languages are simplified. A name that is sacred in one language becomes a bureaucratic label in another. The town's notary struggles to capture cadence, and the negotiator insists on fidelity. The magistrate's clerk ticks boxes and murmurs about precedent. The court requires witnesses with known standing. A quilombo elder's testimony has weight among those who respect local memory, but planters counter with sworn affidavits and letters from merchants who claim the same people as their property. Evidence is not only text. The magistrate eyes the young potter, who stands barefoot and quiet, hands calloused, shoulders straight. The potter's skill is evident in a shard he carries, a small, neat rim of clay that shows wheelwork and temper. An artisan's capacity is, in practice, market currency. Planters and merchants point to that shoulder as proof of value. The quilombo argues that the potter is a resident with community ties and baptized status under local clergy. Bribery and persuasion circulate like a secondary currency. A planter's brother-in-law sits near the clerk. A merchant's gift of a hog or cask of vinegar appears, the clerks will later say, was for the household. Such exchanges alter the courtroom's atmosphere. Historical records note how municipal decisions could bend under social networks, not simply the law's logic. The quilombo's negotiator knows she is up against more than legal text. She stands before a social architecture that privileges property claims. The hearing stretches. Voices rise and fall. A priest is called to attest to baptisms. A coast merchant swears that a manifest shows goods taken on a particular sailing. Sometimes the notary's ink reveals mistakes, dates miscopied, seals that look similar. The magistrate reads these carefully. Sometimes a clerical error will buy time or force a continuation. The smell of boiled coffee drifts in from an open window. Outside, a boy hawks bread, and the murmur of market trade continues as if the courtroom's decisions will ripple outward to price and season. When the judgment comes, it is not swift. The magistrate praises the town's peace and seeks a compromise that will reduce open conflict and cost. He decrees that a small number of names, identified as skilled workers desired by a merchant, be handed over for sale unless the quilombo pays a heavy bond or the town council agrees to assume stewardship. For the rest, he recognizes the treaty's baptismal listing and orders their protection under a conditional status that ties them to municipal oversight. The ruling is procedural, thinly protective for some and ruthless for others. It is designed to calm market actors while preserving order for the magistrate's record. The quilombo delegation returns on the dusk path with a mixture of relief and horror. A few names are safe on paper. Others are now slated to be handed over. The legal system has split the community into categories the traders can accept and those they cannot. The negotiator carries the magistrate's scroll, edges creased by anxious fingers. The elders meet under the fig tree, their faces long lines under yellow lamplight as children sleep in thin bundles. Debate is immediate and bitter. Which names to protect, who will stay to defend a purchased claim, and who will leave in the night with a last parcel of seed. There is no unanimity. Some vow to comply with the magistrate's order to avoid a larger raid. Others prepare to vanish before any handover can occur. A shadowed figure from the town arrives at dusk. A young man who once worked the docks and knows routes out along the coastal marsh. He brings news that a sloop at the river mouth will take a price to carry people clandestinely. The offer is expensive and risky, but it offers escape. Elsewhere, a merchant's agent is already preparing a list, a paper that will be used by a mounted guard at dawn. Night presses, fires flicker in shallow bowls. A child dreams of the ship's hull and wakes to the sound of soft crying. The elders count who will go by boat, who will stay, who will hide, and the community divides along lines of kinship and age. The magistrate's decision has not yet been enforced, but at first light a mounted patrol will ride out with the official warrant. There are hours, not many, to choose. The fig tree shadows lengthen and fall across faces turned to the fire. Names are spoken in low voices, and prayer is stitched into plans. Outside, a distant dog barks, first time since morning, and the sound seems to measure the minutes left until the town's bureaucratic machinery translates ink into action. A mounted guard will arrive before dawn with a list of names and an order to seize those whom the court has deemed transferable. The community has minutes to decide whether to hide, to split families, or to choose who will go. Dawn arrives as a thin blue strip. The mounted guard appears before the first rooster. 3 men with a flat-faced sergeant who carries the magistrate's scroll in a leather tube. They ride up the scrub road on horses still slick with night dew. Townsmen gather at the path. Merchants whisper. Planters edge forward as if curiosity and profit were the same thing. Inside the camp, the air tastes of decision. Some families have already left, slipping through reed beds toward a sloop hidden under mangroves. Others remain, trusting the treaty's conditional shelter. The young potter, hands still smelling of clay, wraps his shard into a child's blanket. A negotiator smooths papers and tucks baptismal lists near her breast as if ink could be armor. The sergeant unrolls his leather tube and reads names aloud in a voice pitched to law. Each name is a drumbeat. The guard dismounts with businesslike calm. A clerk presents the magistrate's warrant and demands compliance. The community answers with a silence that tightens like a drawn string. Bargaining begins in the open light. The negotiator offers what the community can spare: a cask of salted fish, repaired tools, the priest's witness to baptisms. The sergeant stamps papers. The lieutenant eyes bundles with practical hunger. A planter's cousin counts coins half hidden in a palm. The deal is the sort of commerce that collapses dignity into next season profit. At the mangrove mouth, the sloop's captain waits. Small and low, his boat is ideal for slipping unseen. His payment is rum, mats, and whispered promises of secrecy. He checks knots and tides with patient, practiced movement. In his hold, there is cramped room for a few dozen. He will not take the very old or too many children. Such decisions, who loads and who stays, are made in a quick, private calculus of survival. The community fractures into urgent groups. One party moves toward the river under the pretense of fetching water. Feet find hollow ground, fingers part lianas, the wet slap of mud underfoot. A child slips and is caught. A woman hushes him with a low song that masks the sound. They reach the mangrove in staggered waves, first a small cluster, then another, until the sloop's hold groans with breath. Not everyone reaches the boats. At a rear quarter, a mounted bailiff finds a hut's door ajar and seizes two men named on the magistrate's list. A scramble ensues. A potter charges in grief, trips on a planter's dog, and is hauled down. A child clutches a torn blanket corner and looks up with a face that will remember this day as a map of loss. On the bank, the sloop's captain watches riders sweep along the shore and receives a desperate runner, a youth with knotted bundles and frantic eyes. Without pause, the captain hauls him aboard. Another follows. The boat creaks with weight and with muffled breaths. The captain chooses the shoals over delay. He knows the tidal channels by touch and trust. In the compound, the seizure becomes systematic. Ropes and a rough cart move a few captives toward the road. Guards shout for order, and the camp's mood snaps thin as wire. An elder holds a small bead up to the light and calls an old name aloud in the original tongue. The sound breaks through the guard's motion like an axe through sapling. For a breath, a rider halts and squints. Time seems to hold. The sloop noses into wider water. Children cry softly in the dark. An elder sings low to keep panic at bay. A mounted tracker sweeps the bank and signals. The captain feels the shadow of a musket's glint and pushes the boat into the channel. Oar blades splash like punctuation as the vessel slips toward open tide. Behind it, voices thin into the thud of hooves and the clink of iron. Those left in camp move quickly. Wounds are bound with poultices, tools hidden beneath woven mats, smoke signals reset to confuse later trackers. The magistrate's clerk ticks names and marks entries in his ledger. The cart's wheels creak toward town with people who will appear on municipal lists, sold, priced, and woven into the colony's commerce. In the shaded yard, an elder pulls a child close and traces the faded pattern on a cloth that once belonged to a distant river wife. A young woman spits a quiet curse at the magistrate's ink and ties a last seed into her hair. Men whisper roots and rehearse false trails. The air is thick with the smell of smoke and the iron of fear, small, sharp, and immediate. Memory and motion ripple through the camp like a current. Choices are now not only legal, but bodily and urgent. A silhouette rises on the ridge. A cavalryman returning from the river shades his eyes and squints toward the mangrove's wake. He draws a breath and shouts, his voice unnerving, a single note that could be victory or alarm. The camp freezes on that sound. In the mangrove, the sloop cleaves the channel and takes the tide. On the road, the cart's axles creak, and the magistrate's clerk turns a page with a practiced, indifferent hand. The future divides itself in that instant. Flight on water, with the difficult hope of a new shore, or a forced march to market where names are sold and families dispersed. The shout from the rider splits both possibilities like a knife across the dawn. The shout splits the morning like a struck chord, and then the world rearranges itself around movement. On the mangrove channel, the sloop slides into the tide, oars dipping with a soft, urgent rhythm. In the compound, the cart's wheels turn, and the magistrate's clerk lifts his ledger like a conquering flag. Two threads begin to unspool from the same wound, one that moves out over water toward an unfamiliar shore, and one that moves under mule and boot toward market in the auction block. Follow the sloop first. The narrow boat rides the channel with the confident hush of sailors who know how the estuary breathes. The captain keeps to the shoals where the larger rivercraft cannot follow. He steers by the taste of the water and the angle of the reeds. On board, people press together, breathing each other's heat, the salt spray hitting faces like tiny pinpricks. The air is a different kind of pressure now, less about confinement than about the nervous hope of secrecy. Children sleep against chests. Elders hum old refrains that curl round the hull like smoke. When the sloop reaches the river mouth, the sea opens wider, and with it a complex set of choices. The captain can try to run for foreign ports where surveillance is thinner. He can lay up in an unpatrolled cove and wait for news, or he can attempt to trade for a passage on a neutral merchantman. Historically, some fugitives did find clandestine passage, hidden below decks, or in exchange for labor and secrecy, but such voyages were dangerous and expensive. The archives remember some names of captains and a few bribed officials. They remember many more who were caught or abandoned. If the sloop reaches a coastal town like Salvador or the smaller fishing villages, the fugitives find a precarious refuge. Free black communities and networks of Creole and African-descended peoples often existed along coasts and in cities. They could shelter runaways, supply food, or help plan further movement. Sometimes sympathetic sailors, enslaved or free, helped as well. But urban life brought its own liminality. Markets where a careless word or a recognized face could mean arrest, and port officials who sometimes colluded with merchants for reward. For those taken toward market, the road is a series of small humiliations that culminate in the auction square. The cart's jolting pace is a measured punishment. The sun strikes the back of necks and the dust raises in choking ribbons. Arrival at the market is spectacle. Voices swell, buyers cluster like gulls, and the air is thick with the smell of frying oil, horse, and sweat. Merchants arrange captives in lines on benches or in fenced yards. A local notary reads the lot, and a clerk calls the manifest. The auctioneer's voice slices the air, sharp, practiced, and the crowd responds with gestures and upward clucks of price. The archival sense of this is blunt. Registries note the lot, ages, condition, and sometimes the place of origin as if provenance were a brand. The language used at auctions is worth attention because it governs fate. Terms like prime field hand, houseboy, or skilled seamstress convert embodied labor into shorthand that a buyer understands. Physical inspection is a focused ritual. A buyer asks the captive to lift an arm, to flex a hand, to show teeth. The captives, men, women, children, have already lived a life before their bodies become public property. The auction forces a rapid revaluation of skill and body for immediate sale. The public nature of the sale is itself a violence. Families can be split in a single session, mothers separated from nursing infants, siblings dispersed to different owners across the colony. Transport to a plantation, if that is where a buyer intends to send them, replaces the auction square with the ingenio's own sensory grammar. The cane fields smell of crushed sugar and wet earth. The mill's wheel and gears provide a distant, mechanical heartbeat. The boiling house belches steam and the acrid scent of molasses as cane is processed. The senzala, planted near the engine of production, is a long, low building where heat gathers by night and where bedding is thin. The tactile details matter, the coarseness of bedding straw, the hot, stinging smoke that crawls in during the burning season, the constant rhythm of machetes breaking green cane. Work is a regimen invented to force labor into predictable output. Dawn calls, hard physical rhythm, and quotas measured by weight of cane cut or sugar produced. Overseers move through fields like shadows, whistle or shout for pace, and the stick snaps on those who fall behind. Food, maize porridge, salted fish, the occasional small piece of salted meat, is functional rather than nourishing. It keeps bodies working, but often not thriving. Disease, injury, and exhaustion are constant risks. Plantation medicine relied on the knowledge of enslaved healers alongside the occasional visit of a colonial surgeon whose remedies favored the able-bodied for each day's output. Yet, within the Senzala daily life contained resistances both subtle and sustained. Work songs tuned pace and guarded mental space. A rhythmic chant could make field work feel communal and bound together. Small acts, breaking a machete's blade to slow work, hiding a seed to plant a covert patch of greens, or simply refusing to comply with a cruel order, were strategies that reclaimed fragments of agency. Oral testimony and missionary depositions both attest to these practices. They also show the central role of women as healers, midwives, and memory keepers who preserved lineage through naming and ritual. Separation sharpens grief. Mothers sometimes had to leave infants with relatives on distant holdings or hope that a buyer would accept a family unit, an uncommon mercy. Letters and petitions occasionally surface in archives where a buyer or relative pleads for reunion, but the legal and economic machinery often prevailed. Children raised on plantations grew into roles defined by the needs of their owners: field hands, house servants, artisans. Skill claims recorded at sale time shaped life trajectories. A good carpenter might find slightly different conditions than a fresh field hand, but both terms mask the shared structural violence. Rumors of manumission and legal freedom circulate in the same networks that plan escape. Some enslaved people did buy their own freedom, often by working and saving, in rare and difficult circumstances, or by agreement with an owner. Others obtained freedom through military service, religious patronage, or the intervention of kin networks that extended across borders. These legal exits were exceptional and often expensive. Most people, across generations, remained bound or fought for physical autonomy through flight and maroonage. Back in coastal towns, the sloop's passengers may find refuge, or they may be betrayed. Even success at escape did not guarantee a settled life. Fugitives often had to choose between fragile urban anonymity, seeking maroon sanctuary inland, or attempting risky sea passage to foreign ports. Each path relied on networks: sailors, free black communities, sympathetic merchants, or long-standing kin ties that spanned continents. The archival trail here is patchy. We find fragments, port registers noting an unregistered arrival, missionary accounts of clandestine worship, or later narratives that mention a group's survival. But often the arc resolves only in hints and echoes. Those hints compound over time. Some of the escaped families vanish into hinterlands and form or join quilombos. Others integrate into Creole urban life and become part of the dense but precarious fabric of Afro-Atlantic communities. The people sold at auction labor on and resist and survive and die in ways that the ledger rarely captures. What the archives can gather are recurring patterns: the rhythms of landing and sail, the sensory world of senzalas and markets, the legal texts that shape fate, and the persistent human acts of memory and resistance that do not fit in any ledger. Later, decades onward, names and songs from these trajectories reappear in surprising places: quilombo registers, baptismal entries, or the testimonies of freed people who remember a grandmother's river and a mother's lullaby. These traces become the materials of a tangled legacy, families remade under pressure, traditions kept alive as prayer and map, and a human geography that resists the tidy lines colonial paperwork tried to impose. A market's pen closes, a sloop slips into the tide. Time stitches different endings into the same torn cloth. Some families will be reunited generations later. Some will find new polities in the hills. Some will leave names in parish registers that scholars will discover centuries after. The ledger, merciless as it is, cannot hold every human moment. Outside the town, a rider returns with a small packet of papers, the merchant's receipt for sold hands. While at the hidden estuary, the captain counts coins and listens to the low voice of an elder who hums a river's name into the dusk. Both details are real and recorded in similar archives. Both point to futures that diverge. Which futures will endure depends on tides of law, the cunning of people who bind seeds to hair, and the distant politics of empire. The years that follow unfold like a ledger with many columns: purchase and sale, flight and refuge, baptism and burial, songs kept and songs lost. Yet if you listen closely to the landscape of that ledger, you hear other rhythms: quiet acts of repair, naming, and the slow accumulation of memory that will survive paper and auction block. This part of the story follows the scattered trajectories of people who parted at the mangrove, those who fled on the sloop, those taken to market, and those who remained to rebuild beneath the fig tree. Each path sketches a different future, but all are braided by the same persistent human work of feeding children, preserving names, and insisting on continuity. Start with the fugitives at sea. The sloop does not carry only bodies. It carries a small archive, a scrap of cloth with a particular weave, a bead from a necklace, a prayer song hummed low beneath the oars. When they reach a coastal village, the smell that greets them is different from the plantation's acid of molasses. The town's air mixes fish smoke, citrus, and the reek of tannery pits. Here, free black communities and sympathetic sailors sometimes made room. The fugitives approach furtively, masked in the dusk, and there are tense nights where a wrong face at a market could be ruin. Yet some find shelter in kitchens, in the back rooms of Creole households, and in small craft trades where the demand for labor is diffuse enough to absorb newcomers without drawing the attention of planters. Urban refuge is a precarious shelter. Markets here are both lifeline and hazard. A child can learn a trade, spinning, dyeing, carpentry, if given time and materials. A woman might find work laundering cloth for merchants or cooking in a tavern. These jobs do not erase the past, but they can create options. The seamstress might earn the cost of a small plot's literal rent. The carpenter might skill himself into a workshop that repairs boats. In port registers and baptismal rolls, names begin to reappear. Newly Christian, often Portuguesized, but gnawed at the edges by older forms. These archival traces are fragmentary, but they show the slow possibility of reconstitution. Families that manage to weave themselves into urban networks, using kin ties, marriage, and occupational niches to survive. Back on land, those forced toward auction and plantation confront a different arithmetic. Immediate labor, brutal oversight, but also forms of endurance that cannot be reduced to papers. The Senzala's nights become a classroom of survival. Midwives and elders teach remedies drawn from African pharmacopoeia. Elders pass down songs that encode river maps and family names. Men repair tools and fashion small, secret implements that slow the plantation's rhythm. These are tactical acts, subversive and practical, aimed at preserving bodies and memory. Missionary accounts and later testimonies record these quotidian resistances. Secret burials beneath a cooking hearth, the planting of a hidden garden patch that feeds a child, the ritual naming of a newborn in a language officials cannot record. Quilombo life, where fugitives find refuge inland, is another long story. These communities, like Palmares in the backlands of Pernambuco, sometimes expand into complex societies that house thousands, organize defense, and cultivate trade. They become polities with customs, leaders, and diplomacy. Colonial reports, often hostile and fragmentary, nonetheless attest to the scale of some maroon formations and the fact of sustained resistance. In the quilombo you taste, as archival fragments suggest, a different diet and a different tempo. Roasted manioc cakes, smoked fish traded with river folk, and the communal rhythms of work subject to different authorities. Leadership blends martial skill with agricultural knowledge and ritual stewardship. Women, consistently across reports, are indispensable as healers, negotiators, and economic organizers. The colonial state's attempts at containment shift over time. Where brute force fails, law and co-optation try to do what muskets cannot, offer conditional freedom, tax incentives, or land tenure in exchange for assimilation. These offers, pardon for those who submit, land for those who place themselves under municipal jurisdiction, appear in notarial archives and missionary letters. They are uneven and often deceptive, but they reveal a recurring dynamic. The empire's willingness to convert human lives into instruments of social order when that reduces the costs of policing. For some, such agreements buy breathing room. For others, they become traps. Intergenerational memory threads through all of these outcomes. Children born in quilombos carry different names than those sold at auction, but both may carry the same lullabies, the same references to a river no longer visited. Oral tradition, songs, place names, and ritual phrases becomes a map written on bodies and in small domestic objects. Anthropologists and historians later recover some of these traces. A melody noted by a 19th century traveler, a family name cropping up in parish registers a generation later, a pattern of stitches in a quilt passed down through women's hands. These are the buried memoirs that sometimes surface in surprising ways. Legal documents also preserve unexpected continuities. Baptismal registers, manumission papers, and notarial petitions reveal lives that flex between bondage and conditional freedom. Some enslaved people achieve manumission through purchase, by service, or through patronage. Others gain freedom in the chaotic moments of political change, wars, revolutions, or the shifting priorities of colonial administrators. The law is a double-edged instrument. It can enable personal freedom in rare cases, but it more often codifies the machinery of exploitation. Still, the archival presence of a freed person's name, no matter how small, can act as a hinge for descendants centuries later tracing lineage. Revolts and insurrections, large and small, punctuate these decades. Some are quick and localized, born of a demand for immediate food or of a cruel overseer's whim. Others are organized and sustained, rebellions that sweep plantations and force broad responses. The historical record preserves both, bloody reprisals and, at times, negotiated settlements. Battles do not always decide the arc. Persistence does. The existence of quilombos years after their founding shows that resistance is not always defeated by force. Memory, law, and song conspire to create a stubborn cultural afterlife. In courts, petitions for reunions sometimes succeed. In towns, Creole communities maintain networks of artisans and sailors who facilitate clandestine movement. In the hills, quilombos endure or reconfigure. These varied forms of survival feed each other. A hidden garden patch might feed a child who later learns a trade in town. An escaped family's song might travel with a trader who remembers an old river and later tells a neighbor. The Atlantic world is a network, however brutal. Kinship, commerce, and aid crisscross and create openings. You think of the small objects that keep a life intact: a bead threaded into a child's hair, a scrap of cloth folded into a pocket, a pot rim kept as a token. These items recur in depositions and missionary records. They are the fragile evidence of continuity. They travel across sea and land and sometimes survive into later archives, museum labels, parish inventories, or family memories recorded by a niece in a later century. And yet uncertainty remains. We cannot reconstruct a single named life from start to finish without gaps. The archival record is a sieve. What we can do is assemble the textures: the pungent smell of an Ingeno's boiling house, the sound of a drum measured by night, the bright glare of an auctioneer's sun, the hush of hidden gardens. We can trace patterns of flight and settlement, of legal contest and cultural survival, and we can honor the resilience threaded through all those patterns. As decades turn, political winds shift, market forces, imperial wars, and changing moral discourses, some shaped by abolitionist thought, reconfigure possibilities. The final turn of any life we have been is uncertain in its details but not in its broad shape. The Atlantic crossing reorders families, memory persists in unexpected artifacts, and resistance, legal, physical, and cultural, continues to shape the world that human beings inherit and hand on. Tonight, as you hold that tiny bead or the fragment of cloth, ask which page of the ledger you carry. Is it the line in a magistrate's log? Or the song kept in a lullaby? The two are not separate. They mix in the palms and mouths of those who survive, and their traces will surface in places historians only later learn to look. A courier arrives at the quilombo's outskirts bearing a single sheet, a royal edict rumored to change the calculus of manumission in the colony. The paper is thin, the ink formal. The elders gather to read it by lamplight. Its words might alter everything or nothing. The candle flickers as the first line is read. The elders read the sheet by lamplight, the thin paper trembling between calloused fingers. The edict's formal language slides off the page in a kind of official music, references to the crown, phrases about regulation, and administrative procedure, a paragraph that hints at eased procedures for petitions of manumission when certain conditions are met. None of the words promise freedom like a door left wide. Instead, they sketch an administrative opening, a process for petitions, an appeal to municipal magistrates, and the possibility of royal review in cases of contested ownership. The language feels both brittle and enormous, an invitation that might be a snare or a hinge. Silence follows. The elders exchange the kind of looks that measure risk as precisely as they measure seed. The woman who once traded at the port notes the clause about petition fees. The elder who reads parish records points to the paragraph where baptisms are referenced as evidentiary support. Someone else, a man who remembers a previous treaty's betrayal, coughs and says that paper can be a weapon as much as shelter. These reactions are not mere pessimism. They are memory of how ink and law have folded lives into new categories before. News travels faster than one might expect. By morning, the village has a new texture, whispers at the water draw, the barter of rumor for bread. In town, the notary's office already hums with clerks translating the edict into an account of profit and liability. Merchants and planters read legalisms as economic instruments. For many of them, the edict represents both a fear and an opportunity, fear that more freed people might challenge labor supplies, opportunity to formalize and monetize the legal machinery that turns human movement into contracts. This dual reading of the edict, the colonizer's arithmetic, will shape how the law operates on the ground. A cautious correspondence begins. The quilombo sends a messenger to the parish priest and to the municipal hall, requesting an explanation and citing the treaty that earlier promised provisional protections. At the same time, a planter's agent files a petition asking the magistrate to clarify property claims in light of the edict, arguing that any ambiguity would harm investment. Both are practical moves, one to secure space within law, the other to defend market interests. This legal choreography, petitions, counter-petitions, witnesses summoned to attest to baptisms, becomes the new battleground. What the edict does not say plainly is as important as what it does say. Royal dispatches often leave enforcement to local magistrates and municipal councils. The Crown's voice can be strong in principle and thin in practice. Historians note this pattern across Atlantic colonies. Metropolitan directives create room for legal maneuvering, but eventual outcomes depend heavily on local officials' biases, on planters' influence, and on the parish priest's willingness to record baptisms and witness petitions. The quilombo's negotiator knows this. She knows that the path from royal paper to actual freedom will be paved by clerks, bribes, and the stubborn facts on the ground, families, gardens, and the memory of the auction block. Debate within the community quickly divides along pragmatic lines. One faction argues that the edict, properly leveraged, could secure legal protection for children and elders. Baptismal records and the priest's signature could serve as documentary anchors in a magistrate's hearing. They propose a campaign of documentation, registering births, recording marriages, producing witness statements from sympathetic port workers. This plan is painstaking and slow. It assumes that law, once engaged, can be made to work in favor of those who know how to speak it. Another faction distrusts legal remedies altogether. Their memory of earlier treaties warns them that a paper can be twisted. An agreement today can be nullified by a merchant's complaint tomorrow. They fear that the edict's procedures will become tools for merchants to demand verification, and that the process will expose vulnerable names to predatory buyers under the pretext of legal scrutiny. For them, the safer tactic is mobility. Disperse before clerks can compile lists, move inland and deepen ties with other quilombos, keep the roots and songs that chart escape. These are not abstract strategies but lived calculations of survival. The elders attempt synthesis. They recognize the edict as both threat and opportunity and propose a two-track approach. First, they will quietly gather baptismal and household records they can claim, encouraging voluntary baptisms by trusted clergy who have historically shown sympathy. Second, they will maintain readiness to disperse. Caches of seed are doubled, hidden routes are rehearsed, and a small flotilla of contacts at the river mouth is consolidated in case a rapid departure becomes necessary. The plan reflects a hard lesson. Legal recognition is worth pursuing, but only if the community retains physical options to retreat. Implementation begins with small, precise acts. Women collect names for a register. Elders recount dates and family relations. The trader-turned-negotiator rides to the parish with a bundle of testimonies and an offering for the priest. The parish is a complex ally. Its registers can record births and bind the crown's language to individuals. But the priest also sits within a social network that may incline him toward the town's merchants. He listens with a cleric's formalism, asks for witnesses, and, for a fee that feeds the parish coffers, agrees to write entries that will look authoritative in a magistrate's hand. Meanwhile, in the merchant quarter, planters convene. They consult lawyers and notaries, parsing the edict for loopholes. Some planters propose that the edict be used to demand that quilombos register dependent persons so that their status can be clarified and, should disputes arise, transferred. The language is careful but chilling. Clarify status here is shorthand for opening the community to legal scrutiny. A steady drip of letters and petitions begins to flow toward the municipal hall, each one shaping the magistrate's forthcoming docket. The magistrate, who in earlier years balanced municipal peace with planter interests, finds himself in a delicate posture. If he enforces the edict too openly in favor of manumission petitions, planters might denounce him and leverage metropolitan connections. If he resists petitions too robustly, he risks royal displeasure for failing to implement a crown directive. His advisors counsel caution, require documentary evidence, insist on sworn testimonies, and push for bonds where necessary. Bureaucracy becomes a throttle. Fee schedules, witness requirements, and hearing dates can either speed or stall petitions, depending on how they are used. In town, an initial hearing is set, an administrative session to interpret the edict's local scope. News of the date circulates back to the quilombo. The community prepares. Copies of the priest's entries are made, witnesses are lined up. A young man who once worked at the port and knows merchant names is rehearsed to attest to continuous residence. At the same time, scouts reconfirm river routes. The sloop's captain, who aided earlier escapes, waits in the mangrove with his boat checked, and the men who can row in the dark alerted. The dual preparation is deliberate, paperwork in one hand, paddle in the other. Dawn of the hearing arrives with the same thin light as other decisive mornings. The delegation departs, 2 elders, the negotiator, and the port witness, bearing records and a quiet hope. Behind them, the community tightens caches and whispers prayer songs that double as maps. The magistrate's hall, the parish register, and the court docket have become a frontier as dangerous and necessary as any palisade. What the magistrate will do with paper, that is the hinge between market and memory. The edict may become protection for some, a trap for others, or simply another instrument in a long game where law and force trade blows. The delegation's footsteps on the town road are the measure of that uncertainty. A mounted courier crosses the ridge with an urgent note. A planter has filed a counter-petition demanding immediate enforcement on a named list of persons, arguing the edict cannot retroactively alter prior sales. The 2 legal claims now collide in the magistrate's docket. The hearing begins, and every signature, every baptismal entry, will be argued not only as proof, but as currency. The courtroom is full of small sounds that mean everything. The scratch of a quill, the rustle of paper maps, the low cough of a man trying to steady his voice. Outside, the town's market carries on as if the day's business can be disentangled from the law's machinery. Pigs snort, a washerwoman paces her basket, and a boy sells warm bread. Inside, however, the air tastes of ink and tension. 2 legal claims sit on the magistrate's table like opposing tides. The planter's counterpetition arguing that prior sales cannot be undone, and the quilombo's petition invoking the crown's edict and baptismal evidence. The magistrate presides with a face practiced in weighing social pressure. He is a man whose nights are filled with both petitions and tavern talk. His decisions must thread between royal instruction and local stability. He begins the hearing by insisting on documentary proof, baptismal entries, witness affidavits, and notarial seals. He dispatches his clerk to fetch copies and summons the priest, who arrives smelling faintly of candle wax and vinegar, a small, worldly figure who has long been the community's intermittent ally. Witnesses take the stand. The port negotiator speaks first. Confident gestures, an intimate knowledge of merchant names, and a slow recital of the treaty's terms. She places a baptismal book on the table and runs a finger along a line of inked entries. Names, dates, godparents. Her voice falters only once, when she mentions a child born under a fig tree and the way the community sang to keep the baby breathing. For the quilombo, this register is not mere paper, it is a memory transformed into evidence. Opposing her, the planter's agent offers ship manifests and a notary's certificate that, he insists, prove transfer of property prior to the edict. He evokes the sanctity of contracts, the sanctity of investment. He gestures toward a merchant who testifies that he purchased specific hands in good faith, showing a receipt that binds him in the market's logic. The notary's wax seal, imperfect and slightly smudged, carries its own gravity. Translation complicates testimony. The port witness quotes names in the old tongues. The notary renders them into Portuguese equivalents that sound thin and unfamiliar. The magistrate pauses at each mismatch. Clerks confer in whispers. This slippage of names, one of the very violences of the trade, works both for and against the quilombo. On occasion, a child's old name reappears in the register as a baptismal alias. On others, the magistrate's clerk can argue that the names are not the same people the merchant claims. Cross-examination is brutal in its politeness. The planter's lawyer asks precise, leading questions. Where were these baptisms recorded? Who witnessed them? Could the entries have been added after the sale? The quilombo's negotiator answers with memory and a modest courage. The priest's signature is genuine. The witnesses are known townfolk and a sailor who remembers seeing the procession. A port worker, an ex-dockman with a hand scar, tells the court how he saw children taught songs in the quilombo and how he later saw two of them pulled onto a cart. His voice carries scrimshawed weariness. His testimony matters. Evidence of bribery and persuasion circulates beneath formal speech. A planter's brother arrives with a hamper for the clerk. A merchant slips a coin to a lesser witness's palm and says it is for expenses. The magistrate watches these gestures like weather signs. He can call them out and risk an uproar. He can ignore them and let the legal process erode into a marketplace. The tension is visible in the court's small gestures: a clerk's hesitation, a notary's folded hands, a priest's distracted gaze. Midway through the hearing, an unexpected voice rises, the young potter who had been seized months before. He speaks in blunt, halting Portuguese, his palms scarred from clay, and his voice new with anger. He says a single, devastating sentence: that he remembers singing a river's name under the fig tree, and that the pattern on a potsherd his daughter keeps came from a kiln in their village. The magistrate leans forward. The potter's shard is produced, its temper and style examined by a local craftsman called as an expert. Material culture becomes testimony: a broken rim, a woven pattern, the residue of a river clay that ties a person to place. Legal argument settles into fine distinctions the public does not always hear: whether baptismal entries prove domicile at the time of an alleged sale, whether a manifest's dates predate or postdate the entry, whether a merchant's receipt is conclusive, absent the physical presence of the named person at the time of sale. The magistrate scribbles notes, pauses, and then, in a voice leveled by long practice, proposes a compromise meant to diffuse market anger and avoid royal censure. His ruling is a bureaucratic scalpel. For a subset, those whose baptismal entries are clear, whose witnesses are credible, and whose artisanship or familial ties are well attested, he grants a conditional status: protection under municipal oversight, pending a bond posted by the community or a friendly patron. In practice, this means some people will gain a fragile legal shelter if someone posts a bond or pays fees to the municipal chest. For another group, those the planter proves on a manifest, the magistrate rules in favor of enforcement, allowing sale unless the quilombo can provide irrefutable provenance or pay a heavy bond to contest the claim. The decision splits the community not only on paper, but in body. In the public square, planters murmur approval, merchants applaud the preservation of contract certainty. In the quilombo, the news arrives like heat, a mixture of relief and dread. A small number of names are temporarily safe, others are slated for handover unless cash or quick movement intervenes. The magistrate's conditional protection is a thin thing, legal shelter that requires resources the quilombo may not possess. The negotiations that follow in the magistrate's outer office are practical and painful. The port negotiator offers what she can: a cask of sugar, harvested fish, and the promise of labor in the town's docks to anyone the merchant will accept as apprenticed workers. The town's constable weighs the offer against his purse. A patron, an influential merchant who backed the magistrate's appointment, steps forward and offers to post a bond for a few names in exchange for the quilombo's services as steady labor. This private bargaining is part of how law often operates in the colonies: justice mediated by relationships and purchase. As dusk falls, the camp's people hear the day's outcome in fragments. A father clutches a potsherd like a charm. A mother secures a child's blanket with extra knots. Those whose names the magistrate has protected sit under the fig tree and count seeds into their palms. Those with warrants begin rapid, somber packing. Some choose to wait and bargain. Others slip at night toward the mangrove, following the old river songs that teach safe passage. At the quay, the sloop's captain receives a hurried messenger, a list of names needing clandestine passage. His eyes narrow at the risk and the pay. He stokes his small hold with fern and reed and pulls his boat close to the mud, listening to the sound of oars on water like a premonition. A pickup night is arranged. The mangrove mouth will take a few more. The rest must face the magistrate's warrant. The magistrate's ruling buys time, not certainty. For some, paper means breath for a season. For others, the morning's cart will appear, and the road to auction will open again. The day ends with the taste of iron in mouths and the rustle of petitions being written by candle. The legal world has altered the community's map. The old channels, river, trail, song, are still there, but now they must be navigated in a landscape where ink and bond can decide whether a family remains whole. As midnight approaches, a mounted courier arrives at the town gate with a terse note. a foreign brig anchored off the coast is flying a neutral flag and awaiting coastal pilots. Rumors suggest a privateer's captain is offering clandestine transport for those with gold or guile. The note is passed quietly to the quilombo's negotiator. The possibility of sea passage, an expensive, dangerous option, suddenly reopens an old choice. The community gathers in the dark under the fig tree. In the hush, each name now spoken has weight. Each plan will shape whether a child sees the next harvest. Outside, a tide moves in, and the distant brig's lanterns shimmer like a promise or a trap. The brig's lanterns tremble like distant stars, and the decision narrows to a line. The negotiator weighs coin in one palm, and the memory of chains in the other. A clandestine sea passage promises a narrow freedom, crossing a stretch of ocean to a foreign port where municipal warrants mean less, and where a person might disappear into a crowded dock. But sea passage is costly, uncertain, and often fatal. Captains take money and sometimes leave half the promised complement ashore. Sometimes brig captains are corrupt. Sometimes they turn fugitives over to the highest bidder. The elders speak in low arithmetic: who can pay, who can be left behind without tearing the communal web, and what the likelihood is that the brig is truly neutral. Night trembles with economy and prayer. The captain's price is high: rum, a bolt of cloth, and the promise of future labor. Men count coins scavenged from odd jobs. Women offer a small cache of silver hidden in the rim of a cooking pot. And a friend in town, a barber who owes the negotiator, extends credit with a warning: once you are out there, you are far. Children are bundled into moss and oilcloth. Elders tuck seed in a single pot shard into small packs. The decision dissolves into fragile agreements. Those with kin in the hills will try to go inland. Those with a coin or two for the captain will try the sea. The infirm and very old will be hidden beneath thick fern and carried if danger arrives. Boarding begins at moonrise. The mangrove channel is a black throat. Oars whisper, and the captain's men work with the economy of people used to moving unseen. The brig itself bobs farther off, its silhouette a dark, polite threat against the horizon. The sloop rides close enough to transfer only a few at a time. Each crossing is a small crucible, 2 hands pushing, 1 lowering, breath held, a child's protest muffled by a shawl. On board the brig, the air smells of tar mixed with old wine and the sharp oil of lamps. The captain watches faces with a detached business sense. He speaks little, collects weight. Who is fit? Who can work? Who will be left below decks? Below decks, the brig is not a merchantman's bright hold, but a compromise between secrecy and space. Men and women are stowed in rough hammocks, a thrum of sea, the creak of rigging above, and the oppressive perfume of sweat and salt. The captain warns in blunt Portuguese: no cries, no trouble. You are hidden only so long as you stay still. And a sympathetic sailor, a hand who once had a family lost to the ledger, slips a small piece of salted fish below a blanket. Another hums a line that sounds like a river song, and for a moment human memory threads through the ship's timbers like a bright seam. The brig puts to sea with a soft tug of lines and the creak of blocks. On shore, the magistrate's clerk prepares lists for transport. Mounted men organize the cart and the deputy who will lead the walk to market. The legal machinery moves in daylight's bureaucratic efficiency, while clandestine motion slips through night's loopholes. Both currents are real and immediate. At dawn, the brig is a smudge farther out and the sloop returns, lighter, a handful of people left behind, and a handful gone. The sloop's captain watches the brig's course until it becomes a small dot. Then he turns toward the river mouth and disappears into estuary haze. On the quay, the magistrate's cart loads and the mounted guard begins the slow march toward the town, and eventually the auction yards. The community has split in 2 practical ways, by choice and by force, and each group will now face distinct worlds. On the brig, life is brittle but forward-moving. The captain's destination is a neutral port with a busy market and a diaspora population that might hide newcomers unnoticed. The sea is a liminal place where names slip their repeated syllables and are given new forms. In ports with large Creole communities, small bits of urban refuge, fugitives could find jobs in kitchens, in markets, and in boatyards. They could also face predation and re-enslavement. The brig's captain knows every permutation. Safe harbor brings profit and risk. A stopped ship invites inspection. A favored harbor can become dangerous if officials collude with planters. Those left to the magistrate's warrant face the public ritual of sale. The carts jolt and the guards shout. are instruments designed to compress a life into a public commodity. The auction square is a shape of morning light, sun striking wooden poles, buyers clustering beneath canvas, the smell of frying oil thick. Men and women are inspected, evaluated, and called by lots. The official notary reads the lists, and the auctioneer's practiced cadence begins to carve prices into air. The record in municipal ledgers is quick and savage: names, prices, destinations. For many, the sale will mean the ingegno, or the town's households. For some children, it will mean apprenticeships. All outcomes are caught in the mercantile grammar of value and use. Back in the quilombo's remnant, those who either could not or would not go, the work of reconstitution begins anew. Women tend hidden gardens and bind wounds left from raids. Elders rehearse travel songs and teach children encoded lines that map safe routes. The community's social architecture bends toward endurance. Marriages are arranged quickly to bind families. Work duties are redivided to mitigate lost hands. A small school of apprentices forms, where artisans teach a trade that might raise a future patron or buy an escape. The quilombo's cultural memory is turned into practical infrastructure. In the midday heat, someone hums a lullaby that doubles as a map, and children repeat it as a game. The magistrate's cart arrives at the auction square with its cargados, and the town's population leans in for the spectacle of human commerce. The auctioneer's voice is a musical instrument, measured, practiced, made to spike bidding and mask the human heart. A woman for household service, clean hands, quick, fetches a price. A man described as steady with cattle brings another. The broker's tally is merciless and public. Yet even amid sales ritual, one sees human defiance. A mother presses a woven scrap to a child's mouth, singing a private song. A potter snaps a small piece from his palm, as if to save a memory. A buyer hesitates over a child's eyes and offers less, his indecision a tiny human mercy amid violence. On the brig's deck, a child looks over the rail at a sky heavy with gulls and wonders if the unseen shore will keep its name. Below, in the auction house, a ledger's ink seals a transfer that will be stamped into decades of life. Both are true. Both will generate memories and songs and future petitions in parish records. Late that afternoon, a courier arrives at the fig tree bearing a single, urgent sheet. The magistrate has scheduled follow-up seizures for those the court left as contestable. The community is frayed but not finished. The announcement forces an immediate congregating of plans. Who will try the river? Who will bribe a clerk? Who will stand in court with newly produced witnesses? The day's divisions reassert themselves into urgent choices. You watch as the sun leans toward the western cane line. On the mangrove horizon, the brig's mast becomes a thin pinprick. The auctioneer's last hammer falls in town with a cold, human finality. Between the 2 points, the silent sea and the crowded square, levies have been remade. Paper has marked names. Songs have kept routes. The old ledger continues, and each act of survival will be debated and reworked in markets, courts, and hidden camps for years to come. A messenger from the town arrives with a rumor. A letter from Lisbon about broader shifts in colonial policy is on its way to the governor. The word spreads like a ripple, another possible hinge, or another bureaucratic trap. The community gathers again under the fig tree. Some vow to pursue petitions in town, others will vanish into the hills. The night that follows tastes of ash, ocean, and the thin iron of legal ink. The choices already made begin to show their first consequences. The governor's courier travels slowly, the paper folded beneath his coat like a dangerous thing. Months become a grind of hearings, counter-petitions, clandestine meetings, and the small arithmetic of daily survival. The municipal chest fills with petitions, and the quilombo's negotiator treats legal procedure like weather, predictable in pattern but treacherous in sudden storms. She trains others to gather witness statements, preserve baptismal entries, and copy notarial notes that might be needed in a magistrate's hall. Meanwhile, the hinterland reshapes itself. New fugitives bring other songs and languages, and their ritual practices braid into the community's memory. Craftspeople teach trades in quiet workshops. A basket maker who remembers a distant river becomes indispensable because baskets carry seed and food. A midwife's knowledge of roots and poultices spreads and becomes shared medicine, saving lives that the magistrate's ink would otherwise only register as deaths. The legal dance yields small victories. A magistrate may grant temporary protection to an elder on humanitarian grounds. A notary may accept a baptismal entry as evidence for a child's status. A merchant might post a bond rather than seize a person immediately. Each success requires reciprocity, work rendered to a patron, a cask of sugar, careful cultivation of social ties. Every successful petition builds precedent. Clerks file notes that later negotiators point to as legal support. But law is ambivalent. Clerks make mistakes, names misspelled, dates miscopied, and those errors create gaps that planters exploit. Wealth and standing let some men introduce witnesses whose words carry weight in court. The quilombo learns that law can shelter life and can be turned against it. Strategy becomes twofold: use courts when advantage appears, and keep routes and songs ready if the legal net tightens. Over a decade, the community's social fabric thickens. Children born beneath the fig tree become potters, midwives, boatmen. Those who fled by sea learn urban trades and send small remittances. Women's networks extend into towns where laundries and kitchens provide cover for clandestine documents. Sympathetic sailors ferry messages hidden in casks. Transatlantic commerce produces odd alliances. A captain who once owed a favor may slip a crate of provisions to a friend in the hills. Cultural survivals become strategic assets. Songs encode river directions. Lullabies double as maps of marsh and thorn. Pottery patterns preserve village names. These are not ornaments. A verse learned at 3 can guide an adult past a snake-infested ford. A potter's rim can help a family prove provenance in magistrates' papers. Continuity of memory becomes legal and social capital. Beyond the hills, metropolitan debates begin to seep in. Moral critiques, economic reflections on the cost of policing, and missionary objections influence colonial policy in partial ways. Royal directives sometimes open administrative doors for petitions. Other times, metropolitan council is used to justify tighter control. Outcomes depend on a magistrate's temperament, planter lobbying, and a parish priest's willingness to record births and baptisms. Generations pass, and the ledger's texture changes. Some family lines find tenuous breathing space through baptismal records, petitions, and the goodwill of a patron. Others remain scattered, rumored in port registers, remembered in oral stanzas, listed in distant inventories. Over decades, patterns emerge, repeated petitions that thread the same family names through court books, baptismal lines recurring in parish registers, occasional manumissions filed when owners face economic or moral pressure. Nothing is secure. A punitive expedition, a hostile magistrate, or an economic slump can erase years of patient work. In one dry season, the community disperses into swamp until fever and pursuit pass. Later, they reassemble where old routes have shifted. Flight, concealment, return, and reconstruction become the routine metrics of survival. Material traces surface in surprising places. A potsherd appears in a later excavation. A parish clerk's ledger yields a baptismal entry tucked into a drawer. A signed manumission turns up in a lawyer's trunk. These buried memoirs, beads, cloth fragments, a priest's smudge signature, become the hinge for descendants and scholars centuries later. They are slender proofs, but powerful. A bead threaded into hair can confirm kinship. A cloth weave can support a claim. Two legacies become visible. One is legal and public. Names inked into parish books, petitions that accrete into municipal practice, manumissions that convert bondage into conditional freedom. The other is cultural and private, songs that map escape routes, recipes preserved against hunger, and family names whispered under breath. Both forms of inheritance shape descendants and the social geography of regions long after any particular quilombo is destroyed. The archive is noisy and partial. Court books preserve market claims and legal wrangling. Missionary accounts record testimony patterned by pious perspective. Parish registers list baptisms and burials, but often Portuguese names. Oral songs, by contrast, hold place names and river knowledge that seldom appear on paper. The historian's work is to hold these fragments together without forcing them into a tidy line. Tonight, decades after the auction and the sloop's secret voyage, a young woman from the quilombo's line finds a faded paper sewn into a mat, a baptismal entry with a priest's wavering signature. The name is imperfectly Portuguesized, and the date curled, but the ink survives. She traces the letters with a reverent fingertip. If she takes this document to the magistrate, she can file a petition to claim protection for a living relative. The chance is narrow, and the risks are clear. As dawn approaches, voices in the compound whisper the same question that has shaped generations: to trust the paper or trust the road. The decision will be made in the morning, where ink and tide both tip the balance between market and memory. Dawn loosens into a thin, trembling gold when the young woman folds the baptismal entry into oilcloth and sews it back into the mat with hands that have learned both quiet craft and furtive calculation. Her fingers feel the ridge where the priest's ink cut paper long ago. She can still smell candle wax and the faint iron tang of the quill. The act is small, liturgical. To hide paper is to hide a witness. Around her, the compound breathes in the slow pattern of a place that has endured too many mornings with decisions to make. She moves like a woman who has rehearsed walking in two languages at once, the one of song and land, the other of receipts and ink. At the river bend, she picks up the path that knows every step, wading through wet reeds that lick her ankles. The air there smells of mud, river rot, and citrus peel tossed by some passing boat. A child clings to her skirt, blinking sleep from eyes that have glimpsed too much. They meet a scout who carries news that chills the spine. A mounted patrol was seen 2 valleys over this morning, moving faster than usual and with a courier's ruthless precision. The scout spits a small curse and alters his route. The woman's heartbeat quickens in the chest like a trapped bird. Choice is not a single motion, but many small reckonings. She could return to the fig tree and fold the paper again into quiet. She could hand it to the negotiator and let others assume the legal risk. Or she could go alone to the parish and to the magistrate, carrying evidence in a body that might be searched. The decision is sharpened by the math of proximity. The longer they wait, the more likely a planter's agent will file a counterclaim. The more they move, the more they expose themselves. She chooses action, deliberate, dangerous. The road to town is a ribbon of dust and heat. Birds flit and quarrel above the sugarcane. A child asks for a story, and she tells a line of the river song that maps a hidden ford, as if reciting it might embed that knowledge in a nervous system. At the town gate, a constable eyes the procession. Barefoot, patched cloaks, a child tucked close. He lets them pass with a glance that is both bored and precise. He has seen many such mornings where the poor come with petitions and the rich with bribes. Inside the parish, the priest looks older than his register, more fatigue in the hands that sign than in his voice. He recognizes the negotiator and greets her with a reserved kindness that has a cost: favors to be remembered, candles to be burned, an offering for the parish chest. The woman unfolds the mat, palms steady, and reveals the baptismal entry. The priest runs a finger down the faded letters, and the candlewick smoke seems to gather in the room like a soft judgment. He asks careful questions: names, dates, godparents, and then, quietly and with the cleric's mixture of conscience and caution, agrees to add further attestation if the witnesses can be brought. He will sign a supplemental note that the magistrate will regard as authoritative, but he asks for time: a day to consult the parish log, a night to confirm the notation, and a small payment that goes to the church's repair fund. Time here is elastic and dangerous. Word of the woman's petition radiates back toward the quilombo before the ink has fully dried. At the fig tree, elders speak in low voices, weighing the cost of exposure. A courier brings news that sharpens the morning. A planter has indeed filed a second, urgent counterpetition, claiming 3 additional names as his property, asserting that the ledger lists them as purchased prior to any local baptisms. The town's pulse accelerates. The magistrate is inclined to process the planter's petition quickly. Market certainty compels expedience, unless intervention delays him. The woman, the priest, and the negotiator decide on a 2-pronged move. The priest will prepare the attestation, the negotiator will take it, with the original baptismal entry, to the magistrate at once. Meanwhile, the woman will return to the quilombo with word out and arrange secret caches and safe routes in case the court's wheels grind towards seizure. Their choreography is precise and intimate, paper in one hand, paddles and trails in the other. The magistrate's hall smells of old lint, ink, and a faint undercurrent of sweat. He sits behind his desk, sleeves rolled, a man whose authority is as much social currency as it is legal. The negotiator lays the baptismal entry and the priest's attestation on his table. She speaks slowly, providing witness names and dates. The magistrate listens with the practiced face of someone who must hold royal instruction, local peace, and planter interest in balance. He thumbs through files, comparing the parish's notation with a merchant's manifest that has just been produced by a town clerk. The planter's counter-petition. As the negotiation thickens, a sudden sharp knock breaks the room's tense politeness. A mounted courier stands in the doorway, cloak flecked with mud, a sealed dispatch in his grasp. The clerk's hand goes pale. The courier's arrival is not routine. Royal or gubernatorial dispatches require immediate reading and can alter municipal procedure on the spot. The magistrate, who has been weighing artisanal shards against merchant receipts, calls for the seal to be broken. The paper smells of salt and a different ink, and the script glitters with an official formality that tightens everyone's throat. He reads aloud. The dispatch is brief but consequential. The governor, answering a recent metropolitan directive, orders a temporary suspension of local manumission proceedings pending a thorough audit of prior sales and an inventory of contested persons within the colony. The suspension is framed as administrative prudence, an inquiry to clarify titles and prevent retroactive disturbances of commerce. But its effect is immediate and cold. No petitions may be adjudicated until the audit is complete, and magistrates are instructed to prioritize petitions that present indisputable documentary proof or those tied to service recognized under specific statutes. The room quiets as if the ink's coldness has sealed the air. For the negotiator, the priest, and the woman, the dispatch is both a problem and a clarifying fact. The administrative suspension freezes the very tool they hope to use. For the planter, it is a victory thin as a scrawl but effective. For the quilombo, it is a pivot point. Paper from the governor's office has just reasserted the market's dominance by legal fiat. Outside in the town square, carts keep moving. The market does not stop. But inside the magistrate's chamber, the future, already precarious, narrows in a new way. Officials will now compile lists, request inventories, and send clerks into quarters to take stock. The audit will bring more eyes to people who have tried to grow a life outside municipal purview. The woman feels the gravity of that change, like cold water poured over both hands. She realizes the deadline is not now a court date, but a bureaucratic dragnet that will come with clerks and mounted men. She steps back into the sunlight, holding the mat that contains the baptismal entry, her mind racing through the possible moves. Hide the document deeper, disperse families before inventory lists are collected, or try to buy time with gifts and petitions to clerks. Each choice is costly. Behind her, the negotiator speaks of immediate shipment of witnesses to town and of a plan to enlist a sympathetic merchant to intercede. The woman thinks of the sloop and the brig, the small oars and the costly captain, and the children who might not survive a sea crossing. The magistrate's suspension has not given them victory. It has given them a new kind of pressure. As she walks back toward the river path, an anxious scout collides with her, breathless. A group of municipal clerks is already moving toward the quilombo with a list of names compiled from recent petitions and manifests. They will arrive before dusk. The woman can see the line of dust behind them already, like a thin wound crawling across the land. For a moment she stands still, the mat heavy in her hands, the baptismal paper hidden beneath the stitches. Around her, the land hums with birds and distant cane cutting. Under that music is the slow, implacable rhythm of bureaucracy. Ink, ledger, seal. The day has turned into a race between paper and song, between clerks' lists and the lullabies that map safe passage. The clerk's dust will be on the road before night. The woman must decide, stay to face ink and audit, or disappear into the map their songs have long kept. Her choice will shape which names remain tied to parish ink, and which will be carried into the hills by oars and song. Dawn comes like a soft promise and a verdict both. The clerk's dust has already scoured the road. Men with lists have come and gone. Some houses stand emptied, shutters closed against the day. What follows in the years after that fraught morning is neither simple triumph nor total defeat. Instead, it is the slow, complicated work history is always made of. Small victories, bitter losses, legal paper that sometimes helps and often fails, and a cultural persistence that refuses tidy erasure. In the immediate arc, some families who slipped onto the brig found a precarious anonymity in a busy harbor where Creole communities, sympathetic sailors, and bustling trade allowed them to recast their names and labor. They washed pots in crowded kitchens, patched sails, learned an urban trade or two. Those lives were narrow but durable. A seamstress built a small clientele. A boatman's hands learned to read tides and routes that once saved him. A child tutored in a clandestine school learned to count and later filed a petition that bore a grandmother's awkward, fading signature. Such transformations, the quiet accrual of small freedoms, are the archival pattern historians see when they trace a baptismal line or an apprenticeship record that surfaces decades later. The paper rarely tells the whole story. The songs and household objects do the rest. Other families never left the Ingeno. The auction's hammer closed on their names. And life's architecture there was brutal, but also threaded with survival strategies. In the Senzala, the steady work of midwives, the hidden gardens, and the slow, stubborn preservation of names and stories kept a cultural flame alive. Craftspeople taught apprenticeships under the watchful eyes of captors and friends. A potter's rim, remembered in a daughter's hand, became proof in a later petition. Here, abolition's long arc, combined with economic changes and occasional acts of manumission, opened narrow doors toward freedom for some. For others, freedom would arrive only in a later generation, when networks, law, and the messy politics of empire finally shifted enough to make legal claims plausible. The quilombo's remnant, those who buried seeds under fig roots and who learned maps of bird calls and reed bends, became something neither the colonial ledger nor the magistrate's seal could fully capture. Over years, these communities grew, shrank, reconfigured. They adopted new songs and merged with incoming fugitives who carried new phrases, new recipes, new names. Where they endured, they became polities of survival, small farms, defensive palisades, and social customs that managed labor, conflict, and childbirth. Some became thorn in the colony's side for decades. Others negotiated temporary peace by offering labor or goods to neighbors. The archive remembers raids and skirmishes against them, but it also contains surprising traces of trade, lists of goods exchanged, a notary's receipt for provisions bought from maroon traders, the occasional letter noting the existence of an elongated settlement that had schools, potteries, and an organized calendar. Legal life continued to be ambivalent. Royal edicts and metropolitan debates sometimes opened doors, a notarial record of manumission here, a parish ledger entry there. Yet local power often bent those doors back toward commerce. Magistrates' rulings oscillated with planter pressure and merchant appetites. Clerks' hands, bribed or honest, could either validate a family's claim or leave it dangling. Over the long century, the combination of moral pressure, abolitionist thought seeping into public discourse in Europe, and economic shifts, changing profitability of forced labor in certain crops, created conditions in which some enslaved people could assert claims to freedom, often with the help of sympathetic patrons, strategic marriages, or persistent petitions. The victories were rarely sweeping, but they mattered. A single manumission could make a lineage's path different for generations. Across all these material and legal changes, cultural continuity remained a stubborn engine. Songs learned in the hold became ritual work songs in the fields. Lullabies hummed under the fig tree-encoded river fords and safe houses. The small objects, the bead tucked into a child's hair, a mat stitched with a priest's faded signature, a shard of pot whose clay matched a family's river, became witnesses in ways the magistrate's ink rarely was. Museums and parish archives later hold some of these artifacts and papers, but often the richest archive is oral. A grandmother's refrain about a river that no map names anymore, a recipe for a cassava cake that resists hunger, a stitch pattern that signals kin across a market. There is an ethical complication in how we tell this story. Much of the narrative we have assembled rests on fragments. Merchant receipts, notary seals, missionary accounts written often with moral or imperial agendas, and the occasional petition that survived the fires, floods, or negligent clerks. To fill these gaps responsibly, we rely on patterns corroborated across many sources, and on the testimony that did make it into parish registers and notarial ledgers. Where the record is silent about a particular person's inner life, we acknowledge the silence rather than invent details. This practice, honoring partial records while listening for the traces of the people who left them, shapes how memory is recovered and how dignity is restored. Decades drift into generations. Some lines marry into town families and become shopkeepers, sailors, or artisans. Others remain tied to the land, descendants of quilombo communities who keep ceremonies and manage plots that have been communal for centuries. The names change in spelling, but not always in sound. The lullabies mutate but preserve river notes. A potter's rim appears in a museum drawer with a museum label that notes its likely origin. A parish register listing, once dismissed as a clerical afterthought, becomes a key to reuniting a family line in a modern genealogy project. The deeper legacy is both tragic and human. The forced crossing remade the Atlantic world, producing diasporas and cultural blends that would, over centuries, seed foodways, music, language, and kinship structures across continents. The violence of the sale and the specificity of the auction's cruelty remain central facts. Yet alongside that horror grew unplanned cultural forms. Languages that braided Kimbundu syllables with Portuguese cadences. Music that turned a work chant into a hymn. Cuisines that mixed cassava roots with new spices. Out of coercion came adaptation, and, through adaptation, a persistent human creativity that no ledger could extinguish. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scholars, activists, and descendants begin to sift the archives with different eyes. Legal documents once used to police bodies are read as potential proofs of kinship. A bead found in a museum catalog sparks a small, determined genealogy. The match with a family's oral memory becomes a kind of truth. A baptismal entry turned up in a parish drawer fuels a modern petition for recognition and restitution. These recoveries are imperfect and fraught. Paper is brittle and memory is contested, but they are meaningful. They convert silence into testimony and show how the buried memoirs continue to speak. You close the story where memory often begins, with an object. A mat, stitched with a priest's faded signature, emerges from a trunk and is handed from mother to child. In the mat's weave are invisible repairs and a hidden pocket containing a scrap of paper, a baptismal page whose ink has not yet faded entirely. The child runs a thumb along the letters and hums the old lullaby as if the two acts are the same thing, reading a name and remembering a river. In that small, almost miraculous moment, the ledger's ink and the song's rhythm meet. The legal paper did not always save them. The road did not always win. Yet together they made life possible for some. The world that emerges from those choices is messy and human, marked by loss, but animated by a persistence that is at once heartbreaking and beautiful.